Welcome to FolkFear, where the breath of the forgotten still lingers and the past never truly rests. In this channel, we uncover cursed traditions, whisper the stories buried by time, and breathe life into the spirits bound by ancestral blood. These are not tales for comfort. These are truths wrapped in silk, sealed in jars, and soaked in the tears of the unwilling. Step quietly and listen closely. Some rituals were never meant to be repeated. In the highlands of northern Vietnam, where the mountains sit heavy with mist and memory, there lies a village untouched by progress, but haunted by its own customs. Here, every home hides a secret, a jar sealed with wax and ash, holding the spirit of a girl who was never wed. These spirits were promised rest, but not all promises are kept. This is the story of Tuan, a boy burdened by debt, drawn into a ritual he never understood, and a bride who was never meant to be chosen. Tonight, we unseal what should have remained buried. Tonight, we open the Matchmaker's jar. The call came just after midnight. Not a phone call, but a whisper through a dream. Tuan awoke in his cramped apartment above a garage in Hanoi, breath catching, hands clammy. In his ears echoed a woman's voice he didn't recognize, soft and broken. "Come home before they take it all." He didn't sleep again. By morning, the actual call came. His cousin, frantic, told him his father was in trouble, again, gambling, again. But this time, the men who came weren't just threatening, they were collecting. His father had signed the house over, the ancestral home in Linghua village, the home Tuan's grandmother had died in, the one no one had touched in years. "They'll take it in 2 weeks," his cousin said, "unless you do something." Tuan had nothing, no money, no favors left to pull. He hadn't spoken to his father in nearly a year. The old man had turned into a husk of himself after his wife died, a shadow playing cards in smoky rooms, coughing up phlegm and broken apologies. But the house, it was the last thing left that belonged to his blood. So he packed a duffel bag. Tools, 2 changes of clothes, a lighter, and an old cassette player with half a tape still working. He took the bus that crawled north through the mountain roads, deep into the folds of a place time had forgotten. Linghua, population maybe 50. No reception, no Wi-Fi, just thick green trees, cracked stone pathways, and roofs that sighed under the weight of rot and memory. His father didn't meet him at the gate. The house stood alone, hidden behind creeping vines and a rusting ancestral gate carved with symbols Tuan couldn't read. He hadn't returned since his grandmother's funeral. Inside, the air was stale, thick with incense ash and mildew. The wooden altar still stood in the main room, covered in yellowed photos, burnt offerings, and a cracked porcelain bowl filled with moldy rice. Dust coated every surface like a forgotten blessing or a curse. Tuan found his father passed out on a straw mat in the back room, an empty rice wine bottle beside him, barely breathing, murmuring fragments of old songs and names that belonged to the dead. By nightfall, Tuan sat alone on the back step, staring out at the trees swaying in the windless dark. He felt the weight of the house pressing on his shoulders, not just physically, but spiritually. There was something about being here that made his skin crawl, as if the house was watching him. The next morning, She came. A knock at the gate. Slow, deliberate. Tuan opened it to find an old woman in layered red robes, her face wrinkled like dried fruit, eyes sharp as broken glass. She leaned on a walking stick made of twisted bamboo. Her smile was polite, but too still. "You are Tuan," not a question. He nodded. "And you are?" "I'm Bangwan, the village matchmaker." He blinked. "Matchmaker? I'm not looking for—" She waved a hand, silencing him. "I know why you came. Your father's debts, the house at stake." He frowned. "Did he send you?" "No, but your grandmother did." She paused. "Before she passed, she arranged a backup plan." Tuan folded his arms. "What kind of plan?" "A wedding, to a bride who has waited a very, very long time." Tuan stared at her, thinking it was some sort of senile joke. But she didn't smile. "She's in the attic, sealed in a jar, unmarried, restless, but she comes from a powerful lineage. If you agree to the ritual, the debt will disappear, the house will remain, you will be provided for." He laughed dryly. "A ghost marriage? Seriously?" Bangwan's voice dropped. "You'd rather lose the house?" He hesitated. "I thought you were a man of the bloodline," she added. That stung. She handed him a folded red cloth. "Tonight, go to the attic. You'll find the jar beneath the altar beams. Do not open it. Do not speak to it. Just bring it to the ancestor room and place it beside the incense bowl." Before he could protest, she turned and walked away, her steps barely making a sound on the gravel path. Tuan stood there, red cloth in hand, wondering if he had just been cursed or saved. By sundown, he could no longer ignore the whispering in the walls. The house groaned like an old throat clearing itself. The shadows in the corners moved just a little too much. The altar room flickered with candlelight he didn't remember lighting. He found himself drawn upstairs, each step creaking beneath his weight. The attic door hadn't been opened in years, cobwebs thick as curtains, dust floating like ghost breath. In the far corner, under a pile of rotting fabric and termite-bitten boxes, he saw it. A jar, red lacquered, sealed with dark wax, carved with strange symbols that shimmered when he looked directly at them. A long crack ran across the lid, as if something inside had once tried to get out. He didn't want to touch it, but he did. It was cold. He wrapped it in the red cloth, carried it down the stairs, arms trembling. As he passed the altar, the wind picked up outside, the candles blew out. The house fell utterly silent. In the flickering dark, Tuan set the jar beside the incense bowl. The moment it touched the wood, the silence cracked, like ice breaking. A sound followed, low, wet, like someone breathing through water. Tuan stumbled back, heart racing. The jar remained still, wrapped, silent, but he felt it. Something inside that did not sleep, something watching, something waiting. He should have walked away. He should have run, but instead he whispered to the air, "I accept." Behind him, the incense reignited on its own.
and the red cloth shifted as if something inside the jar had heard him.
Tuan had always considered himself a man of logic. He fixed things, machines, engines, radios with broken wires, not ancestral shrines and whispering jars. But that night, as he lay awake on the thin mat beside his father's unmoving body, he couldn't shake the sensation that something was awake in the house. The air no longer felt empty. It felt shared. He tried to sleep, but sleep refused him. Every time his eyes closed, he heard it, a faint rustling, like silk brushing wood, the soft clink of porcelain shifting ever so slightly, and once, only once, the distinct sound of a woman humming an old wedding melody, slow and cracked, like it was being sung through water. He woke with his heart pounding, lips dry, throat tight. There was no one there, and yet something had changed. At dawn, Tuan lit 3 sticks of incense at the altar, unsure whether it was for the spirits or for himself. His hands trembled. His father hadn't stirred since yesterday. He didn't speak, didn't eat, didn't even open his eyes, just lay there breathing shallow, face pale as parchment, as if something in him had already crossed over. Tuan placed a hand on the jar. It was still cold, even colder than before. He touched the red cloth around it. It hadn't moved, but it was no longer wrapped as tightly. The edges had unraveled just enough to show a carved symbol etched into the lacquer, one he hadn't seen the night before. It looked like a pair of wedding rings tied together by string, but upside down, broken. A knock came at the door. Bangwan stood outside once again, already waiting before he opened it. "You slept with her in the house. That was bold." Tuan frowned. Nothing happened. "You think so?" She stepped past him, her eyes scanning the room. When they reached the jar, her lips tightened. "You didn't unwrap it, did you?" "No." "Good." She tapped her cane once. "Do not ever let her see your face. The veil is still holding, barely." Tuan gestured to the altar. "What exactly is inside that thing? Who is she?" "She was called Mai, a girl born in a year the stars deemed inauspicious. Her birth fell under the widow's moon, cursed to bring misfortune to any husband." Tuan blinked. "And that's why she was never married?" "That's why she was only fit for ghost marriage." The old woman's voice dropped. "She died before her time, drowned in the river. No funeral, no proper rites. So we sealed her spirit, contained it." "To use later?" "To give her a place, a husband, a purpose. Otherwise, she trailed off. Spirits like hers wander. They curse bloodlines, drain vitality, make crops wither, homes collapse. But if you honor them properly, they reward their new family." Tuan looked toward his father's room. "You think she's the reason he's still alive?" Bangwan didn't answer. Instead, she handed him a slip of parchment. 3 names, a chant, and a list of offerings. "These must be prepared tonight at midnight. Place them before the altar. Burn the joss paper last. But above all," she fixed him with a sharp look, "do not speak to her. Not yet. Not until she is ready." "Ready for what?" "To choose you." He wanted to laugh, but his throat wouldn't let him. That night, he did as instructed. He folded the tiny paper bride and groom in silence, poured rice wine into a chipped porcelain bowl, burned sandalwood incense, and placed the lotus root beside the jar. At the stroke of midnight, he knelt before the altar and began the chant. The air grew colder with each word. Outside, the wind howled suddenly, though the trees did not move. Then came the hum again, clearer now, from just behind him. A woman's voice singing the same wedding tune, closer, louder, then silent. Tuan turned. No one was there, and yet the red cloth had slipped, just slightly, enough for him to see the faint purve of the jar's lid and a black smudge forming beneath the wax seal, like ink bleeding through. He stared. The jar pulsed once. He nearly dropped the incense stick, but the ritual was complete. At least, he thought it was. He burned the joss paper last, watching the flames consume the tiny paper lovers, their red outlines flickering into ash. When the final spark faded, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Then he saw it. A length of red thread, tied into a bridle knot, wrapped tightly around the jar. It hadn't been there before. And something inside the jar shifted, just enough to knock gently against the inner walls. Tuan backed away slowly. He didn't sleep that night again. In the morning, something new appeared. 3 strands of long black hair laid neatly on his pillow. He touched his head. They weren't his. He stepped into the kitchen to splash water on his face and froze. The mirror above the sink was cracked, a perfect, silent break down the middle. In the fogged glass, he thought he saw a second figure behind him, veiled, still. But when he turned, nothing. Still nothing. Until he looked down. Someone had drawn a symbol on the floor, just beneath where he stood. It was made of water, muddy as if it had been traced with fingers dipped in river silt. A binding glyph, Taoist, ancient. He recognized it from temple murals his grandmother used to take him to as a child. Only this one was imperfect, incomplete, and incomplete rituals were dangerous. He ran to the altar room, but the jar was still there, still whole, still silent. He touched it again, still cold, but this time it pulsed twice. That night, he asked the village elder for records of Mai, but the elder shook his head. There are no records, only warnings. She was the last of her line, the kind that should have been forgotten. Tuan pressed. Why would my grandmother store her here? Because she trusted Bangwan, and Bangwan serves the old ways, the ways that should have died with the empire. He left with more questions than answers. The third night, he woke to find his bedroom door wide open. There were red threads strung from the doorframe to the altar, taut and glistening like spider silk. They formed a web, delicate, geometric, with the jar at the center. And dangling above it was a bridal veil, old, yellowed, wet. Tuan reached for it, heart hammering, but before he could touch it, the veil snapped upward, yanked by unseen hands, and vanished into the attic. He climbed the stairs, flashlight shaking in his hand. The attic door was ajar. Dust stirred in the beam of light. He saw the red cloth from the jar, now torn, discarded on the floorboards. And in the center of the attic, a set of muddy footprints, small,
bare, leading to the wall and vanishing into it. He stumbled back down, breath shallow. When he returned to the altar, the jar was back in place, but now it bore a single crack, thin hairline running down its side. He didn't sleep at all. At sunrise, he found his father sitting upright for the first time in days, pale, trembling, but awake. "Father," he whispered, "you're awake." The old man looked at him, eyes filled with fear. "You shouldn't have accepted her. You should have let them take the house." He froze. His father's voice cracked. "They drowned her. You know that, right? They drowned her for refusing a ghost marriage. She wasn't cursed. She was in love." "With whom?" His father didn't answer. He just wept. Later that evening, Tuan returned to the jar. The crack had deepened. A red veil had been laid gently over it, as if placed by an invisible bride. He didn't touch it. He didn't speak. He only whispered one word, barely audible. "Why?" And from somewhere deep within the jar, something whispered back. Not a word, just breath. Wet, cold, waiting. Tone began sleeping with the lights on. Not because he believed it would protect him, he wasn't that naive, but because he needed the illusion of control. In the dim flicker of the altar candles, he felt less alone, or at least he could see what was watching him. But on the fourth night, the lights didn't help. It began with a dream. He stood by the riverbank, barefoot, the ground slick with wet moss. A girl stood a few paces away, her back to him, long black hair trailing down like silk soaked in ink. She wore a white aojai, its hem floating in the water, though she didn't sink. She was humming, the same lullaby he'd heard whispered in the night. He called out, but no sound came from his mouth. She turned her head slightly, not all the way, just enough for him to see the pale stretch of her cheek and the tear rolling down it. Then she stepped into the river and vanished. He jolted awake, gasping, soaked in sweat. Or so he thought. But when he threw off the blanket, he saw it wasn't sweat. It was mud. Thick, wet black river mud clinging to his legs and seeping into the mattress. His feet were dirty, his nails packed with grit. He leapt out of bed, heart racing, and slipped. The floor was soaked. He stumbled into the hallway, leaving muddy footprints behind. The air smelled of lotus root and mildew, the scent of something long dead. He followed the trail of wet footprints to the altar room. The jar sat exactly where it had the night before, but now it had split completely down one side. Something had broken free, or was trying to, and still no sound came from it. Just a kind of presence, like the air was holding its breath. Tone backed away and bumped into the wall. Something sharp jabbed his foot. He looked down. A bone hairpin, old, ivory, carved with tiny peonies. He picked it up slowly. A name was scratched on the side, faint, almost invisible. Mai. His fingers tightened. He turned it over and found something else, dried blood staining the base. Not old blood, fresh. He dropped the pin and ran for the back door. The yard was silent. The forest loomed in the distance, still and watching. His father's old work shed sat in the corner, its roof collapsed in. He stood there in the cold morning air, barefoot and shaking. He didn't know why, but the house suddenly felt hungry. as if waking it had made it remember the taste of grief. Later that afternoon, he tore open the floorboards beneath his bed. Something told him to, not logic, not fear, just instinct. He found them quickly. Scratched into the wood, almost invisible, were rows of symbols, Taoist bindings, but inverted, reversed, like mirror reflections. He recognized them from a book he once saw in a burned temple, Fu Lunsu, a scroll of forbidden rites, bindings made not to seal, but to trap, as if something had been nailed to the floor here, buried without burial. He dug deeper. Beneath the planks, wrapped in black silk, he found an old bridal sash, torn in half, blood-soaked, and still damp. He wanted to run, to scream, to burn the house to ash, but instead he returned the sash to the altar. He laid it beside the jar, unsure if he was feeding a spirit or offering a truce. That night, the whispering began. Not in dreams, not in his mind, in the walls. It came in pulses, soft weeping, like someone trapped behind the plaster, scratching, breathing, and once a voice that murmured his name, Tone. He pressed his ear against the wood and nearly screamed. A woman's voice, right against the other side, whispered, "Let me out." He reeled back. The jar was still whole, but it wasn't sealed anymore. He brought salt from the kitchen, drew protective rings, lit every candle he could find. He even chanted the old verses his grandmother had taught him, though he never believed in them. And still the house breathed. It sighed in the corners, wept in the beams, called to him from every crack in the wood. Then, around 3 a.m., the veil appeared, draped from the ceiling above the altar. No one had hung it there. No windows were open, and yet it swayed gently, like someone was still standing beneath it. Tone reached out. The fabric brushed his fingers, ice-cold and damp. A scent hit him, jasmine and river rot. Then the lights went out, all of them. Pitch black. He stood in silence, frozen. The air changed, thickened. He heard soft footsteps behind him, slow, barefoot, wet. He didn't turn, couldn't. Instead, he whispered, "What do you want?" The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched. And then the voice came, soft, broken, waterlogged. "You." He turned. No one was there, but the veil had gone. The jar sat open, and where it had once stood, muddy footprints led away, back upstairs, to the attic. Tone climbed the staircase, heart pounding like a funeral drum. At the top, the door creaked open before he touched it. Inside, everything had changed. The dust was gone, the cobwebs cleared, the old trunks and boxes rearranged into the shape of a wedding procession, 2 rows of silent wooden shapes facing an altar made of crates. And on that altar sat a photograph. Tone picked it up. It showed a young woman, Mai, standing in front of the river, dressed in white, her smile shy and fragile. Beside her stood a man in monk's robes. His hand hovered near hers, not touching, but close enough that their fingers seemed to tremble toward each other. On the back of the photo were 6 words. "They buried me before I died." Tone stared at it, cold washing through him. It wasn't just a ghost marriage gone wrong, it was a murder. And the ritual wasn't to honor her, it was to punish her. for falling in love, for refusing a cursed tradition. He dropped the photo and stumbled back down the stairs. In the main room, the altar candles had blown out. His father's bedroom door was open. Inside, the old man sat up in bed, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream. His skin had turned gray. Lotus petals lay on his chest, dead, wilted, drowned. Tone fell to his knees. She had taken him. The price of an incomplete ritual, of a lie buried in silence. He wept, but he didn't scream. He knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. She was awake now, and she wanted justice. Not just for herself, but for every girl the village had sealed away. He rose slowly, and in the mirror across the room, he saw her, veiled, silent, standing just behind him, watching, waiting.
Tuan buried his father at dawn. No priest, no monk, no chants. Just bare hands, cracked fingernails, and tears falling into the earth. He dug the grave behind the house, beneath the shade of the long-dead persimmon tree, the same one his grandmother used to tie red threads to for luck. It hadn't borne fruit in years, but as the first shovel of soil fell over his father's body, a single red blossom bloomed at its base. He didn't find that comforting. He found it terrifying, because spirits didn't give flowers as gifts. They gave them as markers, as warnings. When he returned inside, the house was quiet again. Too quiet. The air hung heavy, like it was listening, like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do next. The jar was still cracked, still empty. The veil was gone, but the air smelled faintly of rice wine, sandalwood, and rotting lotus. He knelt before the altar, opened the Matchmaker's scroll, and read the ritual again. This time, more carefully. And there, tucked in the margin, in smaller, faded script, he found it. If the offering is incomplete, the spirit will not be wed. She will be unbound, and she will take what was promised to her. He blinked. There had been no blood offering. He had forgotten the final step. The lotus root soaked in the groom's blood, placed beside the joss paper lovers. He had left it dry. It seemed meaningless then, symbolic maybe, but the spirit didn't see it that way. Tuan rose and looked around the room. He felt her everywhere, not present, not visible, but wrapped around him like damp cloth, hiding in the corners of the walls, in the floorboards, in the gaps between his breaths. She was unwed, unfulfilled, and angry. That night, Tuan lit every candle he had. He laid out the proper offerings again: rice wine, paper clothes, coins, even a small carved comb passed down from his grandmother's altar drawer. Then he bit the inside of his thumb and let his blood drip onto the lotus root. The air shifted the moment the first drop hit, like something exhaled, slow and cold. He placed it beside the jar, which now sat in silence, the crack across its lacquer wider, almost splitting it in two. He lit incense, chanted, burned the offerings, then waited. Midnight passed. Still no movement, no whispers, only silence. But when he woke the next morning, because somehow he had dozed off right there on the floor, everything was different. Coins had appeared beside the altar, old ones, imperial, rusted.
A wedding hairpin had been placed gently behind his ear, not his own. And on the altar itself, someone had written in careful script, "He was not the only one who broke the vow." Tuan read the words over and over. Who else had wronged her? His father? No, his father hadn't even known the full ritual. Then who? He took the note and walked to the matchmaker's house. Bangwan lived on the edge of the village, in a crumbling hut covered in red banners and hanging bones, protection charms meant to confuse spirits. But today, every single charm was broken, shattered. The bones had been snapped, the banners soaked through with rainwater, dark as blood. He knocked once, no answer. Twice, still nothing. He pushed the door open. The interior was in shambles. Furniture overturned, ashes scattered across the floor. Every jar, there were dozens, maybe more, lay broken, their seals shattered, lids split open like cracked skulls. He stepped carefully, heart pounding. The air here reeked of abandonment and incense gone sour. On the far wall was a shelf of scrolls, burnt, torn, their edges curled from fire. But one survived. He pulled it free. It was Bangwan's personal grimoire, handwritten, faded with time and ink, bound in old leather, tied with red twine. He opened it. Inside were names, dozens, hundreds of girls, each one sealed in a jar, each one labeled with the date of death and the family that had offered her. And next to some names, a black mark. He flipped pages until he found Mai. Her name was there, marked twice, once for unsuitable match, and again for refused binding, drowned under full moon. There was a note in red ink beneath. To be sealed, forbidden to wed, break seal, equal, release wrath. Tuan's throat dried. She wasn't meant to be part of a ghost marriage. She was meant to be silenced, trapped, a punishment not for who she was, but for who she loved. He searched the house, calling for Bangwan, but she was gone. No trace, no footprints, just the faint scent of river mud near the door. He walked back to his family's home, shaking. When he stepped inside, the candles had all gone out. The altar was untouched, but something new had appeared. A mirror, old, rimmed in red lacquer, stood upright on the floor. Not his grandmother's. It hadn't been there before. And in its surface, Tuan saw her. Not her face, just the veil, floating, moving, as if someone were standing just behind the glass. He turned quickly. No one. When he looked back, the mirror was cracked, and etched in the glass was a message, "Finish what they began, or join me." He dropped the mirror. It shattered across the floor. That night, the dreams returned, only they weren't dreams anymore. He stood in the village square. Everything was on fire. The temple bell rang without hands. The jars, hundreds of them, sat in a circle, each one glowing red, each one humming with voices trapped inside. And in the center stood Mai, bride in white, eyes hollow, veil floating like it breathed. She turned to him and said softly, "You are not my groom, but you opened the door." Then she raised her hand and every jar shattered. Screams tore through the smoke. Tuan woke screaming. When he opened his eyes, the altar room was full of water, not flooding, just standing, inches deep. And in the reflection beneath the surface were faces, girls, dozens, reaching up, whispering, begging. He stumbled back, slipped, fell, and the water was gone, dry, normal. But the jar, now split in two, had collapsed. Its contents spilled out onto the floor. Not ashes, not bones, just a single red bridal shoe, and a lock of hair still tied with gold thread. He didn't touch them. Instead, he whispered to no one, "I'm sorry." And the house replied, with silence. But in the attic above, something dragged across the floor, heavy, deliberate, like a trunk being opened or a bride turning in her sleep. Toan couldn't stay in the house after that night. Something in it had shifted. Not just the air, not just the temperature, but the very presence of the place. It was no longer a house that held spirits. It had become a vessel, a second jar. And he could feel her watching. Not from the shadows anymore, from within the walls. So he left. Not permanently, not yet, but long enough to breathe, long enough to find answers. The village temple sat at the base of the hills, half in ruin, half forgotten. Its stone lions were cracked at the jaw, its rooftop caved inward like a collapsed lung. Wild plants had overtaken the prayer stones. The pond where the monks once floated lotus lanterns now reeked of decay. But the door was still standing. He pushed it open, and it groaned like an old man waking from a long sleep. Inside, dust floated in columns of light. Faded murals lined the walls, dragons coiled around pagodas, phoenixes dancing among cherry blossoms. But one painting had been slashed, almost deliberately. The face of a young woman, hands bound in red cord, floating downriver in a bridal robe. Her eyes had been gouged out from the image. Only the veil remained. Toan moved deeper into the shrine, past overturned offering bowls and burned incense sticks that hadn't been touched in years. He found the monk behind the curtain. Old, blind, skin thin as paper. He was sweeping the floor in slow, patient circles. "You've come late," the monk rasped without turning. Toan hesitated. "You know who I am?" "I smelled the river on you, and the fire." Toan stepped forward. "I need to know who Mai was. The truth, no more riddles." The monk exhaled. "Sit. Speak slowly." And so Toan did. He told him everything. The jar, the broken ritual, the visions, the veil, the hairpin, the dream of fire, the whisper that said, "You open the door." When he finished, the monk was silent for a long time. Then he said, "She was never meant to be a bride." Toan leaned in. "Then what was she?" The monk's white eyes turned toward him. "A punishment." And the story unfolded. Decades ago, when the village still believed deeply in bloodlines and balance, a girl named Mai was born during a lunar eclipse. The elders called it a ghost-born moon, a sign that her spirit would wander, never at peace, always yearning. When she reached 16, she fell in love with a monk, a boy named Tin. He was meant to be celibate. She was meant to be matched to a spirit husband, to protect her family's luck. But love, real love, has no patience for tradition. They planned to run, but someone betrayed them. Mai was dragged to the river, dressed in white, red cords tied around her wrists and ankles, not for marriage, for drowning. Tin was made to watch. The elders gave him a choice: help seal her spirit or join her. He chose to live, barely. Toan's voice cracked. "You were him." The monk nodded once. "I was young, weak, and I have paid for it every day since." Toan stood. "But why now? Why is she coming back now?" "Because the seal was broken. You weren't meant to find her." "She was in my attic." The monk tilted his head. "Then it was your bloodline that sealed her." Toan went cold. "My grandmother?" "She followed the old ways, believed in the Matchmaker, believed that sacrifice brought wealth." Toan stumbled back. "So she knew?" "She helped them drown Mai." The words hit like a punch to the chest. Toan thought of the red threads, the flowers his grandmother tied for good luck, the silent glances she gave the attic door every time they passed. She knew. And still, she left Mai there, waiting, wanting. "She's killing people," Toan whispered. "She took my father." The monk nodded. "And she'll keep taking, until the truth is spoken, until she is released." Toan's hands clenched. "Then how do I do that?" "You must perform the true ritual, not the matchmaker's lie. You must give her back what was stolen." "She wanted to marry you." The monk lowered his head. "I cannot give her that now." Toan looked him in the eye. "Then give her the truth." That night they returned together. The monk stood before the altar while Toan laid the broken jar's remnants in a circle of salt. The air tensed, like a bowstring drawn taut. The monk removed his prayer beads and set them in the center. Then he whispered, "Mai, I was a coward. I let them take you. I let them bind you. I let them seal you for decades of silence. But you were never cursed. You were never wrong. You were just in love." The air moved. The veil floated down from the rafters, slow as snowfall, landing atop the beads. A single candle lit itself. The flame burned blue. The monk closed his eyes. "If you still want me, take me now." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the wind howled. The window shattered inward. Toan ducked. When he looked up, the monk was gone. In his place, only a single red cord remained, frayed at one end, burned at the other. The veil was gone. But in the mirror behind the altar, Toan saw the reflection of the monk standing beside Mai, smiling, hand in hand. And then, nothing. The mirror cracked, and silence returned. But Toan knew better. This wasn't over. This was just one soul released, one jar emptied. There were dozens more, hundreds. He had seen the grimoire. He knew the names. And somewhere beneath the house, under floorboards and old boards, they waited, watching, whispering. The house was not the same after the monk vanished.
The air had changed, not lighter, not cleaner, but colder, as if something ancient had shifted inside its bones, as if a boundary had cracked open, not all the way, but just enough to let things slip through. Toan felt it immediately. The silence that once hung like fog had become expectant. Every board beneath his feet groaned with something deeper than wood. The altar candles refused to stay lit for more than minutes at a time. And though the broken jar still sat in the center of the room, its lacquer split and its contents scattered, it pulsed faintly with warmth, like a thing still breathing. Mai was no longer bound, but she had not moved on. She had simply stepped through. 3 days passed without event. Toan barely left the house. He read through the Matchmaker's ruined grimoire by oil lamp, piecing together the truth between lines scorched by fire. Every page he turned revealed more horror. Each sealed girl was labeled with a birth sign, a date of death, and the name of the family that had delivered her. All were from the same village, most from the same bloodline, his bloodline. The truth sank like lead in his chest. It wasn't just Mai. She had been the first, but others followed. Girls who resisted ghost marriages, girls who loved the wrong men, girls who spoke too loudly or cried too long after being promised to the dead. They were silenced, preserved, jarred. Toan closed the book and vomited in the garden. By the 4th day, he couldn't sleep. He would lie awake listening to the wind, but it wasn't wind. It was footsteps in the attic, light, bare, pacing back and forth, and always just before dawn, the sound of weeping. It came through the ceiling, through the floorboards, sometimes from the mirror, sometimes from within the walls. And then came the knock. It was past midnight. 1 knock, then 2, then silence. He crept to the door and opened it. Nothing but fog, and in the center of it, a single red shoe, the pair to the one that had spilled from the jar. He picked it up, hands shaking. It was warm. The next morning, the villagers came, a small group, pale, trembling. An elder woman stepped forward, eyes sunken with fear. "She's walking," the woman said. "They say she walks through the rice fields at night, with a veil over her face and mud dripping from her hands." Toan said nothing. Another man spoke. "2 children disappeared. They went near the old shrine." A third added, "3 houses woke to find red threads tied around every doorframe. That's a wedding knot, boy, but there's no groom." Toan understood what they were too afraid to say. She wasn't just haunting him now. She was choosing again. And this time the bride had no matchmaker. That night the storm came. Rain fell like nails. Thunder cracked so hard it split one of the persimmon trees in half. And the house changed. He felt it. The moment the wind howled through the broken window, he knew something was coming through. The attic door slammed open above him. Footsteps ran across the ceiling. Then silence. He crept upstairs, each step a warning. At the top, the attic was different. A circle had been drawn in chalk and red thread, a makeshift wedding ring. And inside it, seated on a crate like the throne, was the veil. Just the veil, floating, turning, as if worn by someone almost visible.
Then it dropped to the floor, and behind him the altar bell rang. Toan ran, but the door slammed shut. The jar was gone, the hairpin was gone, and in the mirror she stood behind him, no longer veiled. He turned, but the room was empty. Only in the mirror did she remain, a bride in white, face pale and wet, eyes completely black, her mouth moving in slow, soundless sobs. Then the mirror cracked, and she vanished. Toan collapsed to his knees. The seal was fully broken. Not just all of them. The jars had been vessels, each one now shattered, each one freed. The house had become a shrine, no longer for protection, but for gathering. And they were gathering. That night the villagers lit fires along the river, placed rice in lanterns, burned ghost money. But it wasn't appeasement. It was fear. Toan stood at the edge of the crowd. Someone whispered, "You brought her back." Another muttered, "Your family sealed her. Now she's sealing us." Toan didn't argue. He just walked back to the house, alone. At the doorstep, he found a bundle, wrapped in old cloth. Inside, dozens of tiny bone hairpins, each etched with a name and a final note. "You only freed one. Now free the rest." He wept, because he knew what it meant. He would have to find them. Each spirit, each name, each truth buried by fire and silence, and one by one unseal them. Not for vengeance, but for peace. Because some traditions weren't culture. They were cruelty wrapped in prayer. And the house, the matchmaker's house, the altar room, the attic, it was now their place, their waiting room, their purgatory. And Toan, he was their only witness, the only one left to speak their names. And so he did. He opened the grimoire, lit the candle, and whispered the first name, aloud. The flame flickered, and in the mirror behind him, the veil fluttered once.
Toan didn't sleep for the next 3 nights. The matchmaker's grimoire never left his hands. Even when he walked through the house, even when he stepped out for food, even when he sat motionless beneath the altar, the brook stayed with him, as if separating from it would be a betrayal, not of the living, but of the dead. The grimoire wasn't a book, not in the traditional sense. It didn't tell a story. It recorded debt. Each page was a name, a year, a family line, a ritual description, a justification, and a jar number. The numbers were written in red ink, tidy, exact, emotionless. Niña, age 17, refused third ghost marriage, rebellious, preserved, jar number 22. Tran Tihua, age 14, died during bridal transit, blood curse suspected, preserved, jar number 41. Mai, her name was there too. Mai, age 16, drowned, refused sealing at first, lover found, separated, cursed vessel initiated, forbidden to wed. Beside her entry, 2 words were written in the margins, barely legible under smudged ink. First bride. He read it again. First bride. Not first sacrifice,
not first spirit, first bride. He understood now. Mai hadn't just been another victim. She had been the origin, the foundation for the matchmaker's twisted legacy. Tawan stared at the altar for a long time, his eyes unfocused, hands trembling. His grandmother believed in this. She had participated in it, and now the blood she thought would bring fortune was rising back up to drown them all. The house creaked. A soft thump echoed from the attic. He didn't move. He didn't need to. The whispers began again, faint, rhythmic, layered, not one voice, but many, weeping, chanting, murmuring names he hadn't yet read aloud. They were waiting, all of them. That night, Tawan began the ritual of reading. He sat before the altar, opened the grimoire to the first page, and lit a single candle. Mnyethilien, I speak your name. The flame flickered. He turned the page. Tham Tutrang, I speak your name. The house groaned. He kept going. Each name spoken aloud brought a shift, subtle but real. Candles lighting themselves, windows rattling, a breeze that moved against the grain of wind. By the time he reached the 20th name, the mirror across the room cracked, a clean, single line down the center. It didn't startle him. It felt expected. When he finished for the night, he closed the book slowly. The pages had grown heavier, as if the words now carried weight. And then, as he stood to leave the altar, he saw it. On the floor, drawn in red thread and ash, was the same symbol that once marked the jars. Only this time, it had changed. It was open, incomplete, as if waiting for something else. The next morning, he walked through the village, the grimoire tucked under his arm. He knocked on doors, asked questions. Most people turned him away, but one, an old woman named Ba Tam, pulled him inside and whispered, "You should burn that book." Tawan met her gaze. "Why?" "Because it remembers what we've tried to forget." She limped to a trunk, opened it, and pulled out a photo. It showed 3 young girls standing in a row, each in ceremonial dress. One of them was Ba Tam, barely older than 10. The second, a girl named Dao, who had died of fever. The third was Mai. Tawan recognized her instantly. The same eyes, the same quiet sorrow. "They told us she drowned, but that wasn't the truth." "Then what was?" The old woman didn't answer. She simply turned the photo over. On the back, written in faded ink, "Bride of Silence, 1942. Tawan left her house with shaking hands. The spirits weren't just haunting the village, they were woven into it, still tied to names, to memories, to secrets never spoken. Back at the house, the front gate was open. The altar candles were all lit, and in the center of the room, someone had placed a wedding fan. Old, frayed, stained with blood. It hadn't been there before. He picked it up. A voice whispered behind him, 47 names remain. He turned. No one there, only the attic door, now wide open. Inside, the room had transformed again. The floor was covered in symbols, drawn in chalk and bone dust. Each corner held a bridal object, a shoe, a veil, a necklace, a bundle of joss paper. And in the center, a circle drawn in soot, with a bowl of water at its core. Floating on the water, a reflection, but not of Tawan, of a girl in red, hair loose, eyes shut, sleeping, waiting. He closed the attic door, returned to the altar, opened the grimoire, and began again. Tao, I speak your name. Hyung, I speak your name. Lan, I speak your name. Outside, thunder rolled though no storm had come, and in the mirror, the veil began to lift.
The dream returned on the 8th night, but this time, Tuan knew it wasn't a dream. He felt the cold through his bones, the weight of the damp fabric around his limbs, the pulse of the river underfoot. He stood on a dock made of rotting bamboo, staring out at a wide black river. No wind, no birds, just fog curling low over the surface like smoke from unseen incense. In the distance, a small wooden boat drifted slowly toward him, unmanned, silent. As it drew closer, he saw it clearly, a funeral skiff, the kind used for water burials in the old dynasty. At its bow sat a woman in white. Her veil hung low, soaked through, clinging to her face. Her hands were folded on her lap, wrists wrapped in red cord. She did not speak, but her presence screamed. As the boat stopped before him, she raised one hand and pointed to the water beside her. Tuan looked down. The surface rippled, revealing faces beneath, dozens of them, pale and bloated, hair waving like seaweed. Their mouths opened, but no bubbles rose. They weren't drowning. They were already drowned. And still, they waited. Tuan reached toward the boat, but the woman raised her hand, slowly, and he froze. Not yet, her gesture said. Not until you see. The boat drifted past him, into the mist, and he woke, gasping, soaked. This time, not in sweat, in river water. The sheets were sodden. Mud caked his fingers. Small bits of lotus leaf clung to his neck. The air smelled of jasmine and decay. And beside his bed sat a bowl of black water, still rippling. He didn't question it. He only whispered, "What do you want me to see?" That day, he traveled to the village records house, a crumbling structure that hadn't been used in decades. He found a rusted key in the altar drawer and forced open the warped door. Inside, mold clung to the shelves like a second skin. Scrolls, books, ledgers, all arranged by family name. He found his own, 3 volumes. He flipped through them, scanning the margins for anything that resembled the names from the grimoire. And there, under an entry from 1942, he saw it. Tran Mai, removed from registry. Reason, unnatural death. Spirit offering made by Tran family to maintain harmony. Removed. Erased. She wasn't just drowned. She had been deleted. Sanitized from the bloodline like an infection. He read further. The entry described the ritual. Water binding, river sealing, containment through wax and thread, and the note. Placed under care of Matchmaker, not to be disturbed. Tuan sat in the dust and stared at the words. They had turned her death into paperwork, a line in a ledger, a silence enforced by ink. Back at the house, he lit incense and offered rice to the altar. The mirror remained cracked, the candles burned low, and in the bowl beside the grimoire, the water had turned red. He spoke aloud. I saw her. The wind outside picked up, only outside. Inside, everything was still. He took the bowl
and climbed to the attic. The room was prepared again. Now there was a small boat, handmade, no more than a child's toy, floating in the water dish at the center. It spun slowly in place, pulled by an invisible current. He lit a candle and placed it in the boat. As it floated, the shadows around him deepened, and then she spoke. Not aloud, but inside him. "Bring me home." The whisper was cold, familiar, final. Tuan left before dark. He walked to the river at the edge of the village, the same one from his dreams. There, hidden beneath overgrown reeds and stone statues long eroded, he found what he hadn't dared to hope for. An old pier, collapsed, half submerged, but still there, and tied beneath one of the beams, a rusted chain leading into the water. He waded in, pulled. Something resisted, then a snap, and up from the mud rose a shape, heavy, rectangular, a jar, red, cracked, covered in algae and years of silt. He dragged it ashore, no seal, just fragments of cloth, and inside, not boons, but hair, still black, still whole, still tied with gold thread. He wept, not just for her, but for all of them, because if this was real, then every spirit in the grimoire had a resting place just like this, forgotten, weighted, hidden. He carried the jar home in silence, placed it at the center of the attic, lit every candle he owned, and waited. At midnight, the wind died, the air turned sharp, and the attic filled with the scent of lotus and river stones. She arrived. He didn't see her walk. She was simply there, standing before him, bride in white, veil tattered, eyes hollow, but no longer angry. She looked down at the jar, then at him, and for the first time, she nodded. He understood. He took the broken lid, covered the jar, tied it shut with red thread, not to seal her, but to complete her, to give her a grave. She disappeared. The candles flickered out, and when he opened his eyes, the attic was empty, the air still, the jar warm. And behind him, in the mirror, a girl stood smiling. Then she faded, not like a ghost, like someone finally leaving.
Mai was at peace. At least, that was what Tuan told himself as he walked through the old house and the pale morning light. The air was lighter, the silence less charged. For the first time in weeks, there was no scent of wet silk, no sound of phantom weeping, no whisper of thread dragging along the floorboards. Just quiet, almost peace. But only almost, because the grimoire still lay open, and 46 names still remained. Tuan ran his fingers across the brittle pages, each name like a weight. He had spoken perhaps 20 aloud now. Some had stirred the candles, others had cracked the mirror, but not one had given him a vision like Mai. Until last night. After sealing Mai's remains, he had returned to the altar and whispered the name of the next girl, Tran Ti Hung, and in the silence that followed, he had heard the unmistakable sound of breaking clay. Somewhere not far. He thought it might be the wind. He was wrong. That morning he walked to the edge of the village, past the shrine, past the stone arch where travelers used to be welcomed.
He found the jar beneath an abandoned stilt house, half buried, split down the center. Inside was a single lock of hair, woven into a braid. Old, but not ruined, laid gently atop folded silk. Tuan knelt, hands shaking. These jars weren't just symbols. They were graves. Graves scattered in corners of the village no one dared speak of. Places where shame lived. Places where silence was more important than truth. And now the seals were breaking. Not because someone released them, because they no longer needed permission. Tuan returned home carrying the broken jar. He placed it in the attic beside Mai's, now tied, complete and still. He lit incense, read the next name, Le Ti Nhu. Nothing happened at first. Then a breath of cold wind across the back of his neck. He turned. The hallway behind him was dark, but on the floor, etched in soot, was a single footprint, small, bare, wet. She had come, but not to stay. That night the village shuddered. A dog was found dead wrapped in a bridal sash. The temple bell rang at midnight, though the rope had long since rotted away. And in the rice fields, the workers swore they saw veiled women walking between the rows, dragging red cords behind them. Tuan gathered the village elders, not to ask permission, to tell them the truth. These girls were murdered, he said, holding the grimoire. Not lost, not cursed, sealed, silenced, sacrificed. One elder shook his head. We did what we were taught. Tuan's voice cracked. Then what you were taught was wrong. They would have brought ruin. They did bring ruin, not by living, by being buried alive in clay and forgotten. No one spoke. He held up the book. I will speak every name. I will find every jar, and I will not stop until every soul is free. A long silence followed. Then one old woman, Batam, stepped forward. She placed something in his hand, a bone pin, etched with a spiral. She's under the old threshing house, she whispered. She was my cousin, 14. She only wanted to go to school. That night, Tuan dug through rotted wood and mud-caked stone. He found the jar wrapped in dried cloth, sealed with wax, the glyph barely visible. Inside was a scrap of a notebook page with handwriting, a dream written out in childlike script. I want to see the city lights. I want to be a teacher. Tuan napped. He didn't return to the altar. He buried the jar under a plum tree, placed a stone above it, and whispered her name into the soil. And when he returned home, the attic was humming, not loud, soft, a gentle hum, dozens of voices layered into one, not angry, not mournful, waiting. Tuan opened the grimoire. He didn't read aloud, not yet. Instead, he stared at the final page, the last name. It was written in different ink, older, faded, but clear. Nguyen Thi Ngon, the matchmaker, his grandmother's friend, the woman who had begun it all. And beneath her name, in blood-red ink, a note, bound not in clay, but in service, final vessel, do not release. Tuan's heart thudded in his chest. She hadn't just created the ritual, she had become part of it, a seal herself, a living lock. And now she was gone, swallowed by what she helped contain. And without her, the seals were falling. He turned the page, and the grimoire closed itself. The candles all blew out. The air changed. The mirror across the room cracked again, this time spider web fractures. And behind him, in the reflection, dozens of veils swayed in the air, though no wind moved. He didn't turn around. He only whispered, "I'm still here." The air replied with silence. Then, one word, spoken by many voices in perfect harmony. "So are we."
The rain returned the next morning. Thin at first, a drizzle that tapped the roof like fingers tracing old lines, but by midday it became relentless. Sheets of it poured over the village, soaking soil and memory alike. It filled the rice fields, overflowed the temple gutters, and drowned the narrow footpaths in murky water. Tuan didn't run from it. He walked. Through mud and flood, with the grimoire wrapped in oilcloth beneath his coat and a question heavy in his chest. He was going to find the monk, the same one who had confessed to witnessing my sealing, the one who had once held her heart. He hadn't been seen since the night the ritual failed, the night Tuan had watched him vanish before the altar in a whisper of smoke and ashes. But Tuan had read something in the grimoire's final pages, a passage hidden behind another. A pressed lotus petal had concealed it, yellowed and dry, and on the petal a prayer written in ink. "If the river cannot carry you, the mountain will bury you instead." It was a saying his grandmother used to recite, one linked to a remote shrine built into the cliffs at the edge of Linghua Valley. An old monk's retreat, cut off from everything. And so he went. The trail was nearly gone, swallowed by earth and vines, but the path remembered him as if it had been waiting. The wind howled as he climbed. Fog swallowed the higher paths, and each step threatened to send him sliding into the abyss. But he kept going. One hand clutched the grimoire, the other traced the rope railing strung between weathered stone pillars. Then, finally, he saw it. A wooden door carved into the rock. At its base, dozens of melted candles formed a ring of wax. Each had burned low and died. And sitting just beyond the threshold, still, hunched, and silent, was the monk. Tuan didn't speak right away. He waited until the monk lifted his head. His face was hollowed by time, skin thin and gray, eyes clouded with age, but not blindness. He remembered. "Mai came to me last night," the monk said softly, before Tuan could even open his mouth. "She stood at the foot of my bed, holding a fan I carved for her in another life. She didn't speak. She just waited." "To take you?" "No," he whispered. "To remind me." Tuan stepped closer, lowering the grimoire between them. "I need to know everything, not just what happened to her, but what you did." The monk nodded, hands trembling. And the truth came like ash from a long dead fire. "I was young, a novice. I wasn't supposed to feel anything. I wasn't supposed to look at her the way I did. But I did. I loved her, before I even knew what that word meant. She would leave lotus roots at the edge of the temple, little notes tucked inside. I still remember the first one." He smiled, then it faded. "But the village knew. The matchmaker knew. They said she was cursed, born under the widow's moon, that if I touched her, I'd doom the entire temple, that her blood was tied to ancestral wrath. They made you help them drown her." The monk closed his eyes. "No," he said, "that was my sin.
I felt my breath catch. I didn't help her drown her, the monk continued, voice raw. I bound her. A long silence. She begged me, screamed, called my name, but I held the rope. I chanted the words, because I thought if I did it, she wouldn't suffer as much. I thought I could control the ritual, keep her spirit close. But I was wrong. All I did was trap her. Tuan sat beside him. She said you were her groom. The monk let out a sound, not quite a sob, not quite a laugh. She was already mine, in every way that mattered, but I was too afraid to say it out loud. So they sealed her, and I let them. Tuan opened the grimoire, flipping to the back. She's at peace now, but the others aren't. The monk nodded. They never would be. The ritual was built on lies. The jars weren't for safety. They were cages, a way to keep the women silent while the village pretended it was sacred. I'm going to break every seal. The monk looked at him. You won't survive that. I don't care. You should. Tuan stood. I need your help. The monk looked up. You need more than that. Then he reached into his robe and pulled out a scroll, wrapped in faded red cloth, tied with gold thread. What is it? The original rite, the one that came before the Matchmaker changed it, the one that actually releases spirits, not binds them. Tuan took it, hands reverent. What do I do? The monk stood slowly, leaning on a staff carved with prayer symbols. You finish it. To free them all? The monk nodded once. And maybe free yourself too. They walked back down the mountain in silence. Rain still fell, but it no longer stung. At the village gate, the monk stopped. This is as far as I go. I have already made peace with her. Tuan turned. What if they take you anyway? The monk smiled faintly. Then maybe I'll finally deserve it. He disappeared into the mist. Tuan walked home alone. In the altar room, the candles had arranged themselves into a circle. The grimoire lay open, untouched, but a new name had been added, written in perfect ink. Ting, the monk. Tuan stared, then whispered the name. The mirror cracked again, and this time it wept.
The original scroll smelled of mildew and old smoke. Its fabric was frayed, its ink faded, but the power it held was still alive, humming quietly through each stroke of the calligraphy. It was not a spellbook, not a curse, not even a ritual in the modern sense. It was a promise. Written in symbols that pulsed faintly under candlelight, it described a rite known only by those who had once feared the silence of the drowned. To unbind a sealed soul, it read, you must bring the 4 elements of her sorrow, not to trap her, but to understand her. Tuan read it aloud again and again. The air around the altar tightened. He could feel them listening. The others, not Mai, but the rest. The forgotten girls. The ones still trapped between soil and silence, thread and clay. The scroll laid out the 4 elements required. The garment worn on the day of betrayal. The ashes of the one who sealed her fate. The root soaked in shared blood. The name spoken freely by the living with no lie in the heart. Tuan had 3. He had the veils, the hairpins, the jars and combs and cloths tied with the red cords of unwanted unions. He had the ashes of the monk, left behind in the bowl where he vanished.
He had the lotus root soaked in blood, his own. But the last element, the name, that would be the hardest, because he had to speak all of them in one breath. One ritual, one final binding, but not to trap, to release. He began at dusk, dressed in white, standing beneath the attic's open roof, candles flickering around him like funeral lanterns. The rain had stopped, the air impossibly still. He knelt and laid out the offerings, the veil of Mai, the ribbon of Tran Ti Hein, the writing of Lei Ti Nu, the combs, the cloths, the red threads, one for each jar he had found, each girl he had whispered awake. Then the ashes, the monk's beads, burned and ground fine, placed in a bowl made from temple stone. He sliced his palm, let the blood drip onto the root, and then he opened the scroll and began to speak. The first names came easily: Mai, Dao, Hyun. But then his voice began to tremble. There were too many, and yet they came, not from his throat, but from the air, whispered alongside him, layered, echoed, cascading like a tide of sorrow turned back on itself. 46 voices, then 47, then silence. The wind rose suddenly and sharp, candles died, the attic went black, and in the center of the circle something began to glow. A single thread, red, floating upward like smoke. Then another, then dozens. They weaved through the air, wrapping around the offerings, binding them. And in that moment, Toan understood. He wasn't freeing them. They were freeing him. Forgiveness not given, but offered. A trade. He had witnessed their names. He had carried their memories. Now they would carry the weight of their own stories and rise. The mirror downstairs exploded. The window shattered outward. And from the altar room below, he heard the sound of footsteps. Not one, but many. Toan stood, walked slowly to the staircase, and looked down. They were there, all of them. Girls in veils and soaked wedding gowns. Girls with no eyes, no mouth, no face, only memory. Girls who had once been called curses, now standing shoulder to shoulder like mourners before dawn. At their center stood Mai. She lifted her hand and pointed at the altar. Toan stepped forward, lit one final candle, and spoke the last name written in the book. Nguyen Thi Nguyen, the matchmaker, his grandmother's friend, the architect of the seal, the one who taught others how to turn love into punishment. As her name left his lips, the wind stilled. Every veil dropped, every candle surged upward in flame, and the air filled with the scent of burning paper and river lilies. The girls bowed their heads and vanished. Not violently, not suddenly, like silk pulled gently into the folds of night. But one, Mai, remained. She stepped toward him, no longer veiled, her face clear. She looked peaceful, whole. She reached out, touched his hand, and whispered, "You stayed." He nodded. I had to. She smiled. And then, with the softest breath, she too disappeared. The attic fell silent, the altar room empty. Only one thing remained. The scroll. Blank. Its ink erased. Its promise fulfilled. Toan collapsed onto the floor, tears running freely, not out of sorrow, but relief. They were gone, at last.
Toan woke to the scent of river mud. His skin was damp, his clothes soaked through, but there was no rain, no leak in the roof. He was lying on the floor of the altar room, the grimoire curled beside him like a sleeping animal. The scroll that once held the rite was gone, burned away by invisible hands. The candles had long since melted into puddles of wax. But in the center of the room, something new had appeared. A pool. Perfectly round, shallow, no wider than a basin, but it shimmered like it had depth that went on forever. Black water still as glass. No reflection, no bottom, just darkness. Toan reached toward it, and the moment his fingertip broke the surface, he was pulled in. No force, no violence, just surrender. Like walking through a dream, like falling into memory. He opened his eyes beneath the surface, but there was no river, no water. He stood in a world dimly lit by lanterns floating in mid-air. Dozens, hundreds, each one pulsing like a heartbeat, casting halos across a slow-moving current that glided through an unseen valley. The ground beneath his feet was soft, not earth, not stone, something in between, something forgotten. Ahead, a boat drifted toward him, small, wooden. He stepped into it without question. The boat moved without oars, carried by something older than time. As it glided forward, the lanterns began to flicker, one by one. With each flicker, a girl appeared on the riverbanks, each veiled, each still, each watching. Toan didn't speak. He only bowed his head. The boat turned, and at the center of the water, a bridge began to rise. Not of wood or rope, but of names. He could see them now, written in glowing calligraphy, forming the structure beneath the boat, supporting his passage. Names he had spoken, names he had carried, names the world had tried to erase. And then he saw her, Mai, standing on the far shore. No veil, no gown, just a simple dress. A girl, no longer a ghost. She stepped forward as the boat reached the edge, held out her hand. He took it, and the world around them shimmered, shifted, and suddenly he was beneath the water. Truly, surrounded by the weight and pressure of the deep. But he wasn't drowning. He was breathing, like her. They hovered just above the riverbed, a great stone structure beneath them, an altar worn smooth by time, covered in red threads. And on that altar, a single jar remained, unbroken, untouched. Mai turned to him. "This is the last," she said. Her voice was clear now, not a whisper, not a memory, a voice. Toan stepped closer. The jar was unlabeled, no seal, no glyph, just a single symbol carved into its lid, an eye, closed. He touched it. It opened, and from inside, light spilled out. Not a scream, not a spirit, a song. A lullaby sung in a language no one remembered, echoing through the water like silk on skin,
It wrapped around him, pulled at him. He turned to Mai. "What is this?" She smiled. "This is the first silence, the one they tried to teach us to accept." She stepped back. "You broke it." Tawan looked at the jar again. The light was fading, drifting upward like smoke. And then, he was rising too. Out of the water, back into his body, back into the room, back into breath. Gasping, alone. The pool was gone. Only the cracked floor remained. But something had changed. The walls were dry, the air was clear, the mirror was whole, and the altar untouched, as if nothing had ever happened here, as if no ghost had ever wept here, no spirit had ever begged to be heard. He stood slowly, walked to the window. Outside, the village was waking. Soft footsteps in the mud, voices calling across fields. Normal. Alive. He didn't smile. Not yet. Instead, he returned to the altar and knelt, whispered a prayer. Not for protection, not for power, just gratitude. And when he opened his eyes, a single red thread sat beside the incense bowl, untied, waiting for nothing.
It took 3 days before Tawan heard laughter again. Not his, children's. From across the rice fields, where the earth had been dry for months, a small group played in the mud, splashing water under the gaze of a slowly warming sun. Their mothers stood nearby, watching. Not afraid, not whispering, just watching. Like people do when they're not waiting for the sky to fall. Tawan stood at the threshold of the house, barefoot, the soles of his feet cold from the shaded floor. He hadn't left the altar room since the ceremony, not because he was afraid, but because he didn't yet know how to return to a world where ghosts no longer knocked. Inside, the house had changed, not dramatically, just subtly. The weight was gone. The air moved freely. The mirrors no longer trembled. The attic no longer hummed. Even the staircase creaked like normal wood again, not like bone beneath rope. Tawan walked slowly through each room, each corner, each wall that once whispered. There were no more red threads hanging from the beams, no veil swaying behind doors, no jars. They were all gone. The grimoire still sat on the altar, closed, its cover slightly warped, edges singed by unseen fire. Tawan touched it, warm, alive somehow, but no longer demanding. He lifted it once more, a ritual now, and opened to the last page. Still blank, still final. He whispered a thank you, and closed it. Later that afternoon, the elders came, one by one. They didn't speak much. They brought fruit, incense, a folded robe once worn by a woman long buried. They set it quietly by the altar, bowed, and left. Only Batam lingered. She stood in the doorway, cane trembling in her hand. "You did it," she said. Tawan said nothing. "I saw her," the old woman continued, "last night, in my dream. She stood in my kitchen and smiled, the same smile she had before the river took her." "She's free now," Tawan replied. Batam's eyes welled up. "You gave her back to the world." "No," he said softly. "I just listened." She nodded once, then placed a small bundle on the floor. Inside,
An old photograph. 3 girls. One was Mai. Another was Batam. The third, a girl Tawan had never seen. "She's buried behind the temple," Batam whispered. "No one ever found her jar, but maybe now she doesn't need one." Tawan stared at the photograph. Their smiles were small, soft, like they didn't yet understand how heavy their lives would become, like they hadn't yet learned what silence costs. That night, Tawan sat on the back step of the house and watched the fireflies drift through the trees. He thought of the monk, of the night the jars began to break, of the sound the matchmaker made when her name was finally spoken aloud. He thought of Mai and the song she left behind beneath the water. And he thought of what it meant to carry the memory of someone who could never speak for themselves. A lantern flickered behind him. He turned, but there was no one there, only a soft breeze and a folded veil set gently on the altar. Not a haunting, not a threat, just a memory, a thank you. He picked it up, smoothed the fabric between his fingers, and placed it inside the grimoire. It fit perfectly, as if it had always belonged there. At dawn, he opened the attic. For the first time, it was empty, truly empty. No threads, no symbols, just dust. He swept it clean, laid a mat in the corner, placed a single candle in the center, and sat. Not to wait, not to summon, just to remember. Outside, the village was quiet. Not the fearful quiet, the peaceful kind. The kind that follows too many years of noise. The kind that lets old wounds breathe. And beneath the earth, beneath the rice fields, behind the shrine and the broken gates, the spirits rested, at last.
Autumn came quickly to Linhua that year. The trees along the mountain path turned to the color of old paper and dried blood, and the wind smelled like ash and ginger. Farmers spoke more easily. Children returned to games they once feared to play after dark. The temple bells rang for prayer again, not for protection. Even the animals returned. Birdsong filled the morning silence that had once been reserved only for ghosts. But in the house at the edge of the village, the one with the broken steps and the altar stained by candle wax and tears, Tuan kept his rituals. He didn't chant anymore, but he cleaned the altar, lit the incense, and left offerings. Not out of fear, out of memory. Because once, this house had been filled with girls who had no voice, sealed inside clay jars and erased from the stories their families told. And now, it belonged to them again, as it always should have. He stopped opening the grimoire. It no longer called to him. The names had been spoken, the jars shattered or buried, the spirits gone. But some things don't vanish entirely. Some echoes become the bones of a place. He would catch glimpses now and then. A red thread tied around the gate latch in the morning. A veil draped over the mirror, only to disappear when he turned around. A single muddy footprint near the threshold during the first rain of the season. But they didn't bring dread. They brought presence, like someone had paused by the window, like someone remembered that this place had once been filled with songs and sorrow and stories no one wanted to believe. One night, near the end of the harvest season, Tuan prepared a final offering: rice, tea,
a folded letter. He didn't read it aloud. He just placed it beneath the candle and waited. At midnight, the wind shifted. The air grew still, and from the attic, a soft sound drifted down, brushing silk. He stood slowly, walked up the steps, and opened the door. Nothing. Only the mat where he once meditated, and beside it, a jar, small, pale, new. Tuan froze. He hadn't placed it there. He knelt beside it, heart pounding. There was no seal, no wax, no glyph. But the moment his fingers touched the lid, he felt her. Not Mai, not any girl he had named. Someone else. Someone older, deeper, forgotten. He lifted the lid, and inside, a veil, pure white, unstained, unmarked, except for one detail. It was warm, as if freshly warm. Tuan reached inside, pulled it gently into his lap, and as he did, a folded slip of paper fell from its folds. He opened it. One sentence, written in handwriting he didn't recognize, but somehow knew. The first was not Mai. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat by the altar, veil in hand, watching the shadows move. A realization sinking slowly into him like river water into dry cloth. He had unsealed the stories, but the origin, the true first silence, had not been spoken. He thought of the matchmaker, of the monk, of his grandmother's unread letters, and he thought of the blank page at the end of the grimoire, the one no ink would stay on. He walked to it now, sat before it, opened it again, still blank. But this time, the paper felt different, not dry, almost breathing. He pressed his thumb to it, and it absorbed the touch, darkened. A name began to appear, not in ink, in ashes. A name no one had spoken aloud for a century. A name never recorded, never whispered, never mourned. He read it once, then closed the book. The candle sputtered, died. He sat in darkness, and from the mirror came a soft sound, a single note, a lullaby. Not sad, not vengeful, but empty. A hum from lips long stitched shut. He turned and saw her. Not Mai, not anyone he had ever seen before. She stood at the foot of the staircase holding the white veil. Her face was obscured, but her voice was clear. "You opened their names." He nodded. "I tried." "You missed mine." "I didn't know it." "You know it now." He lowered his gaze. "I'm sorry." She stepped forward, placed the veil back in his hands. "And you are the last seal." And then she vanished. No scream, no flicker, just absence. And from the altar, the grimoire snapped shut. Tuan stared at it. He didn't open it again. Instead, he stood, carried the veil into the attic, placed it in the center of the floor, and surrounded it with candles. He lit each one and waited, not for answers, for peace. Because some stories never find a perfect ending. Some veils never burn, but they can be folded, they can be held, and maybe, if spoken gently enough, they can finally be put down.